Towards the end of our run, we covered a bit of TV, and quite topical TV at that. With Edgar Wright's new film Last Night in Soho due out in the middle of next year, I took it upon myself to watch every single episode of the TV series that gave that director his big break, 1999 sci-fi Spaced, which was the first time that Edgar Wright has ever worked in a proper Three Flavours Cornetto context with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. The following hour is two nerds talking about a damn good TV show. It's not quite film related, but if you've seen the Cornetto films, you can see where the influences came from. This is the Rip Ticket Review, how Edgar Wright perfected his Cornetto. In a week where Anonymous did their thing for the first time in 3 years, 6 people became the new big do, and Netflix announced the long-awaited return of the Big Lebowski to their streaming service. What more would you need from a film podcast than two blokes talking about 14 episodes of a TV show that would result in 3 great movies? Hello, wherever you are listening or watching, and welcome to the Rip Ticket Review, a movie podcast that brings a coat pocket full of Jaffa cakes to your nearest party. I'm TheJackSmit, and joining me over the power of the internet to discuss the work of the one and only Edgar Wright is the Nicholas Angel to my Danny Busman. Good afternoon, Dan Carver.
Good afternoon, Jack. Yes, I think this is one that you were going to take the lead on, which makes a nice change because you've been binge watching Spaced, which was Edgar Wright's 14 episodes. I would say it's his masterpiece, to be honest.
I'd agree with you there. I would actually agree with you there.
This is absolutely. This is when this was first shown on through the British television, we got to see a glimpse of comedy which we hadn't seen in a long time, and we got to see the seeds that Edgar Wright plants, which eventually would grow into the Blood and Cornetto trilogy.
Oh yeah,
but. You know what? I've done enough talking these past 2 episodes. I'm going to pass it over to you, Jack.
Not a problem, Mr. Carver. It's been a real entertaining ride. It all began for me on a random Friday night after a broadcast of The Last Leg on Channel 4. I put the whole first series on and I fell in love with it right away. And I knew right there and then this would be an amazing episode of Rip Ticket. So, for those of you who've been living under a rock for the last 21 years, Spaced is a 1999 sitcom written by Simon Pegg and Jessica Stevenson, who a lot of people will now know as Jessica Hines, because she's got married a couple of times since the series went out. It was made for Channel 4, produced by London Weekend Television, deemed too risky for ITV, because it was all about nerd culture and ITV wouldn't take a serious commission like that nowadays, would they? It centres around two 20-somethings, a comic book artist called Tim Bisley, played by Simon Pegg, and aspiring journalist Daisy Steiner, played by Jessica Stevenson. They'd only just met, and they decide to move in together, and these 14 episodes are essentially revolved around them and their friends, who include Marsha, the landlord, who's played by Julie Deakin, Mike, who's Tim's best mate, played by an up-and-comer who we've not heard much of. Nick Frost is his name, as far as I understand, as well as Brian, an artist, played by a legend from Friday Night Dinner, the one and only Mark Heap. 2 series were made, and then Edgar went Hollywood to go and make Shaun of the Dead. This is the series, as you've quite rightly mentioned, that is the precursor to the Cornetto trilogy. And where do I even begin? I've got to start by mentioning the sheer amount of movie references, because Edgar Wright is the king of the intertextual reference. In our past lives, we talked a lot about intertextual references, did we not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally there from the very first episode, because Channel 4, God bless them, they put out a list of all the film references. There's the very first episode, there is references to the films Green Card, The Shining, and The Evil Dead, and that's just in the first 24 minutes of the series.
Yeah, it's essentially you're looking at Spaced. When you look at Spaced, it's essentially a love letter to the popular culture and cult fiction, including video games, science fiction, Initially, there was a lot of love directed towards the Star Wars trilogy.
Until Phantom Menace happened.
And, you know, all this is done through the main character of Tim Bisley, who is a skateboard-wielding, chocolate beanie-wearing, PlayStation controller playing comic book artist who just wants to make it big and do something that he loves to do, which is create comic books. He works on his comic, isn't it, Dr. Mandrake?
Something like that, yeah.
An orphan boy who has been inadvertently transformed into a giant mutant bear from the experiments of the crazed Dr. Mandrake. Something crazy like that. And I think we can all see ourselves. I think what made this really special is in the 1999 and 2001 was a very, very special time growing up, because the reason that I could see, like, I enjoyed space, and specifically Tim Bisley, that played to perfection by Simon Pegg.
He's literally playing himself.
Yeah.
He's admitted that in the past.
Well, one of the reasons that I could gravitate towards him was because back in those days, the internet was just beginning to take off, and we were starting to see, you know, the internet allowed us to share culture, popular culture and cult fiction across the planet with like-minded people. And suddenly we found ourselves a little bit validated, I guess you could say. We were validated in our love for all of these things, and suddenly you have this character on Spaced who not only loves these things, but he wants to do something with his life. I mean, who back in them days, which 20-some-year-old who was growing up in this brand new world didn't want to do something with someone that they loved doing?
Exactly.
And yeah, I think one of the things that I love about Spaced is it really takes that whole British comedy trope of real situations that we can all sort of like at least relate to, and completely blown out of proportion. And you know, it's I love it. I love it so much. But you are right, there's so many film references.
And not just that, you mentioned the whole idea of the sitcom. This isn't your conventional sitcom in any aspect, because there is film references. This is an Edgar Wright sitcom. So you know what you're letting yourself in for. And you mentioned that this was his first major project where audiences got a glimpse of what was to come. This wasn't his absolute first rodeo, because, of course, in 1995 he made a ridiculously low-budget film, A Fistful of Fingers, which was broadcast on Sky Movies at the time. This was his first properly big commission for a major network, and a network he would be quite loyal to for over a decade, because, of course, Channel 4 have their film wing. And it's no coincidence that 2 years after the conclusion of Series 2, and as it sounds, the last series, we got Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah.
And it's an idea that was firmly planted in the third episode of Series 1. And I made a particular point of mentioning this, because the opening of Episode 1, you have Tim Bisley off his head on drugs, hallucinating while he's playing Resi 2, cracking game, and you see him shooting zombies, and you see hints of that style. You feel like you are in the Winchester watching the iconic Queen sequence go down. It is almost like Edgar has had a plan his whole career to make films that matter to him and his references, and it has paid off quite handsomely.
Yeah, it really has. I mean, it's almost as if he was throwing everything he could into space. And then essentially when Spaced was over, he looks at it and goes, oh, that was a really cool idea. The whole zombie, apocalypse off his head on drugs and a very British way of dealing with the apocalypse. Let's see where we can go with that. Which is fantastic. And indeed, you are right in saying that there are plenty of film references in this series. I mean, Episode 1, where the two protagonists, Tim and Daisy, meet, Daisy decides to use an idea from a film to convince
the photos from
someone
Green Card,
that she and Tim are a real couple. And of course, she gets the idea from the film Green Card. And again, there's another reference to The Shining when being shown around a flat. Daisy and Tim make a horrific discovery in the cupboard, which was essentially a shot-for-shot homage to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
The shot-for-shot remakes are just pure class in this program.
Yeah.
Series 2 is full of them. And one of these shot-for-shot remakes, first episode, Series 2, the standoff from Pulp Fiction is recreated, and it was at that moment that Quentin Tarantino himself admitted that he is a big fan of the program. So much so that he did the commentary for the Series 2 DVD.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But it rightfully got the interest of Hollywood. Tails were wagging at the end of the first series thinking, oh my god, this Edgar dude is such a pioneer in the way he does it, because it's not a typical sitcom, because there's no audience, it's all filmed.
Yep.
What you get to see are the whip pans, the crazy camera work, the very tight editing, frenetic pace with a collaborator who Edgar has worked with his whole career, Paul Mackless, the editor on Space, who worked wonders on Shaun, worked wonders on Hot Fuzz, worked wonders on Scott Pilgrim, because we don't forget Scott Pilgrim here at the Rip Ticket. Of course we don't. But this is like the breeding ground for some of the ideas that would go on to shape the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy. Of the cast is another important part of that. Simon Pegg at the time had done a couple of lesser comedies. Jessica Stevenson, well, Hines now, she'd also done a couple of lesser-known comedies. But what I found particularly surprising was, until this point, Nick Frost had never done any acting at all. This was his very first gig. Yeah,
and I do believe it was Simon Pegg who included the character, and he persuaded Edgar Wright to cast Nick Frost in all of this. This was not Nick Frost's decision. It was written, even though it was created, Space was created by directed by Edgar Wright. It was written and created by Simon Pegg. The two of them were very, very, very close friends back then.
Oh, yeah.
And this was, I guess, Pegg's way of saying, look, I've made it big. You need to join me. We're in this together. And it worked. And Mike Watt is one of the funniest characters I have ever had the pleasure of losing my mind in laughter to. He's just... Nobody could play him other than Nick Frost. It would never have worked. If they'd come up with the character but cast someone else, it wouldn't have worked. Nick Frost made this character. To give you an idea of who he is, Mike Watts, played by the legendary Nick Frost, he's Tim's best friend. He wishes he could join the British Army, but he cannot, owing to the detached retinas he received.
Oh, that's a big spoiler for the end of Series 1, but we'll work to the assumption that all of you have watched it on all four. It's available free on all four.
Yes, sorry. I should have... Yeah, he's eligible,
Spoilers incoming. Spoilers incoming. Oh, well, get them.
So he ends up in the TA, and the reason, when they came out, the reason that he is thrown out of the TA was so funny. I'm not going to spoil it.
That's all I should say. The Euro Disney accident. If you haven't watched this show, get on it, because it is pure class.
And the character itself was based on a recurring joke, believe it or not, between Pegg and Frost.
Seriously, wow.
Yeah. And yeah, it's... Watch it.
Yeah, watch it. That's our recommendation. But there is obviously that chemistry is there from the minute you see these two characters come together for the first time, and obviously when he does eventually make it back into the Territorial Army, there's another one of the film references as well. I've got me list up here as there is a clear reference to Officer and a Gentleman, because Tim carries Mike out of the TA offices, and there's a reference to Officer and a Gentleman, and that was one of the highlights of the outtake reel, because they kept falling over.
Yeah.
It's a program that you can tell they had a lot of fun making, and it's a difficult show to sort of comprehend for modern audiences, because at the time it was a big thing. When it went out on Channel 4, it was in the prime slot, 9:30 on a Friday night, literally in between Friends and Frasier. That is the best slot you could get at the time.
It's also really important to understand the state of TV back here as well. Like we're really, I can't explain to you how different TV is now between when I grew up. I mean, Sky TV was just becoming a household thing.
It had just launched, yeah.
It was just becoming a household thing. It was still around, but you didn't get Sky TV unless you were really well off. It was not a household thing at all. I still remember watching episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation on Sky One back when I was a little nipper, and it was an incredible experience to think, wow, you have all these channels.
Because I remember, I've seen a lot of marketing material from the time, and they were like hamming up the facts like, oh, we are the only place in the UK where you can watch The Simpsons, the big new sensation from America.
Yeah,
that's how big of a deal Sky was back then. And then the BBC got the free-to-air rights.
Yeah. So to understand, that's how big TV was, and so they had to be really careful about where they put these shows on terrestrial TV, because Channel 4 was a terrestrial TV show, and to have this unknown show go up against the likes of Frasier in the primetime slot, that's big.
Yeah, it was literally the lead-in for Frasier. Friends was on at 9, Spaced at 9:30, and then Frasier came on at 10.
Yeah. Friends was big.
And yet, here we are now, and that slot's taken by Gogglebox. How TV's fallen.
Oh, well.
But it's another important note. You mentioned quite rightly, you mentioned how TV was quite different back then. This was technically an ITV production, because it was London Weekend who made it in association with Paramount Comedy, who would go on to become a little thing called Comedy Central. But this would not fit on an ITV channel. ITV was seen as the serious, highbrow commercial broadcaster. Nobody spoke of Channel 5 because they only launched 2 years prior. So naturally,
they were still baby steps.
They were still baby steps for the people who could actually get it on their TV. But Channel 4 were always seen as the alternative. So Spaced naturally found its home on 4. And it has become one of their biggest commissions, and quite rightly so.
Yeah.
And it's obvious to see why, because no one would take a chance on a comedy that was so self-referential, so daring, and yet at the same time would go on to cult has been the word that we've mentioned a lot, and it has become quite a cult show.
Yeah, and you are right that in the sense that nobody would take the chance, and that's what Channel 4 essentially was for back in the day. Nowadays, I think everyone's willing to take a little bit of a chance on certain TV channels. But Channel 4 was essentially the place where if you had this wacky, crazy idea, and the BBC were like, no, we don't want that, we bite our thumb at it, and ITV were like, no, we don't want that, that's a bit too out there.
ITV only cared about Who Wants to Be a Millionaire at that point.
Yeah, pretty much. Then you take it to Channel 4, because Channel 4 were just completely off the wall crazy, and this fitted perfectly with it. Like you've already mentioned, it's so self-referential with movies, but also as well you've got the crazy camera angles, the sound effect, that punctuate the comedy. This was stuff that was very rarely done because it was seen as too cartoonish. And here it is in live action British comedy. Of course Channel 4 are going to want this. They're going to snap this up.
Oh yeah.
And oh my word, thank the Lord that they did.
You mentioned the sound effects as well. Some of the music choices were quite informed. I think one of the moments that set me off laughing big time was in one of the Series 1 episodes where Brian, the artist, is on coat room duties for a party. It's okay, I'll take it to Daisy's room. Magnificent Seven theme kicks in. One of the best jokes of the entire series. I won't give away the full context of the joke, but I watched that episode back, again, researching for this show, and They did a 21st anniversary event before the lockdown kicked in, and that joke got a standing ovation at the BFI when they played the episode again.
But it's also important as well to talk about some of the people who were the recurring characters as well in this, because there's a lot of up and comers on this, people who are now gone on to do incredible things.
Yeah,
like Peter Serafinowicz, one of my favorite comedians.
Yes, Dwayne Benzies.
Arrogant and intimidatingly gravely voiced backstabber.
All I need to say on his character, it's not a bed sit, it's a flat. Paintball guns fire.
And it's Peter Serafinowicz is an absolute. He's just so brilliant in it. And then, of course, you've got another one of my favourite comedians, Bill Bailey, who plays Bilbo Bagshot.
Bilbo Baggins, the owner of the comic shop.
Bizarre. I mean, he plays a character who beats up his dad for slaying Hawk the Slayer was rubbish.
Yes. And then, of course, that character pops up a little bit more in Series 2, post-Phantom Menace. That's one of the things that I love about this programme, is it deals with the expectation and the fallout of that film. Series 2 opens, Daisy comes back from her travels. It's like, yeah, you've got problems, Tim. Yeah, I've got problems with George Lucas. Cut to shot of him burning all his Star Wars memorabilia.
And then you've got Clive Russell, who plays Damien Knox. And this is another thing as well. There's so many comic references on this. Damien Knox is the head of Dark Star Comics. And he is responsible for, a horrifyingly haunting vision that Tim has. And that character is based on her staff from Preach, the comic.
Yeah,
that's incredible. Like, this is, and to understand how incredible that is, what an incredible reference that is. Like, Preacher was just a comic back then. Hardly anyone had heard of it. You had to be well into comics to get that. Like, I can't begin to tell you how incredible that reference is.
It really did do the trick for comic book fans back in the day, because they didn't have their needs fulfilled. It wasn't like we had any TV shows making it all look cool. A lot of people have said that Spaced is one of the few TV shows that gets the depiction of video games perfect, because you don't have any silly sound effects. You just see raw gameplay. Goes a moment, it's like, what are you playing? It's like, Tomb Raider 3. What's it about? Pain, suffering.
But yeah, you are right as well, that in one of those things, it has a lot of respect for the culture that it's referencing. There's no, computer games are silly, blah, 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 comic books are silly, or anything like that. They don't mock them with silly, rubbish sound effects. They treat the culture with the utmost respect. It's like, hey, this is the culture that our characters grew up in, that you've probably grown up in, and this is how it's made them who they are today.
And that's like a nice little sort of hint as to when Edgar would eventually make it big. Major hint to the sort of things he would do with Scott Pilgrim over a decade later.
Like Scott Pilgrim was responsible for a lot of ladies dyeing their hair purple and blue, and
like Ramona, yeah,
to look like Ramona. So he's even had an effect on that. That's crazy. But yeah, again, we see with Edgar Wright, who is a massive pop culture nerd. He is essentially the best way to describe it is Edgar Wright's knowledge of pop culture and video games is the equivalent of Tarantino's knowledge of film.
Which is ironic, because Tarantino and Edgar Wright are like really best mates. Wright would literally go on to program a whole week of films at the New Beverly, which is the cinema Tarantino runs over in LA.
No way. Did not know that.
Yeah, like really close.
Oh, it's really cool.
But again, there's a show you could. It's difficult to keep a program about Spaced down to an hour, but there is so many things. There's another like precursor to the Cornetto trilogy that I found out. Towards the end of Series 2, we see Tim and Daisy planning a night out, and there is a moment it's like, so what are we going to do tonight? Simon Pegg turns to the camera and goes, right. And he lays out his plan for the night, just like he does in Shaun of the Dead. They knew they had the film by that point. They had their eyes on a film by that point. And it was surreal to see Simon Pegg laying out a plan. It's like, well, we're going to go on the tube, we're going to have some drugs so we're absolutely rat-faced before we have our first pints. We stay for the night and we get the last tube home. And they eventually go, because Daisy suggests a more cultured approach, and then as he goes through his plan, big drum and bass kicks in. Of course, very different to what we get in Shaun of the Dead, where we have the music from Dawn of the Dead kick in. You could tell that the footprints were there. They had their ideas, and we were thinking, how much of it can we get away with? What can we afford to license, most importantly? And they were thinking, yeah, so Channel 4 have got this film division. Shall we work with them on developing something? It is a beautiful turn of events for that team, because they didn't know yet, but I was on one of the Space fan sites that hasn't been updated since the series finished. There was a reference to Pegg, Frost and Wright going to Cannes the same year that Series 2 finished to pitch an untitled zombie film. So they were already starting to get the script ready while working on the series. Yep.
And of course, again, going back to what you're talking about in terms of getting, everything ready, Edgar Wright has been recognised as an auteur, because we also see, I sort of briefly mentioned this when I mentioned that, that there's a lot of comedic, cartoonish effects, but these effects are now essentially expected in an Edgar Wright movie.
Yeah.
Tracking shots, dolly zooms, an editing style that includes transitions, whip pans, and wipes, things that you wouldn't normally see. It gives it a very comic book effect, I would say. It's like watching a comic book panel moving.
Yeah.
And you see all this and more in space. I think if you wanted to see a really great example of all his signature editing styles, plus Edgar Wright just throwing his love out there, you've got to look at Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Oh, indeed you do. Indeed you do.
I get, when someone says to me they haven't seen Scott Pilgrim versus the World, I think the only way they can make my day worse is saying, oh, and I've never heard of Pulp Fiction either.
Never heard of Pulp Fiction? Heathen!
There are people in the world that exist that have never heard of Pulp Fiction or never watched it.
Yeah, that's become a big thing. And Pulp Fiction, one of the films, directly referencing space. It's almost like everything comes back to this show for us.
Yeah, it is. It is essentially because, of course, Edgar Wright did do things different from this. He directed the comedy series Asylum in 1996. Then you mentioned 1995, A Fistful of Fingers, his first feature film. But his keystone was Spaced, definitely.
And the Americans, of course, wanted a slice of the pie. And unfortunately, there was an American remake mounted. McG was to produce it, and it sucked.
Yeah.
Because you can't do Spaced unless your name is Edgar Wright.
Well, you can't do Spaced even if you're Edgar Wright, because it's not an it's a British. It's so essentially British comedy. It can't be I'm sorry, no, you can't do it in American. It's like trying to make, I don't know.
Well, not only that, the American remake came 8 years after the end of Series 2. So it was so outdated by the time it made it over there.
Yeah. Oh dear.
I've only seen clips of the American remake, and I'm glad I've only seen clips, because if I was to watch any more, I would be putting the rant music on and going nuclear on it right now, because it does not look good at all. But okay, then, what would you expect? McG was a producer.
Well, probably one of the reasons why it sucked was because Wright, Pegg, nor Stevenson were at any point approached about the American remake, which has
that explains a lot. That explains a lot.
Which Edgar Wright calls McSpaced.
Yes. I mean, when it came out, they were like, yeah, we're making a film about British police procedurals now. We're beyond that. Because this is around the time Hot Fuzz was in the works.
Crazy stuff.
Crazy stuff indeed. But some of the other film references, again, we mentioned Edgar being like the king of the film references. First episode of series 2, they're with good times because they reference the bloody Matrix. That whole plot, even with a parody bullet time sequence as well. This is 2001. The film was still fresh in people's minds. It's almost like that they lived close to an Odeon. Other cinemas available, of course. It's almost like Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, and Edgar Wright watched movies together. And again, you can see because of that, this is where they got their natural chemistry. And Wright talked about it on Twitter. Yeah. He live tweeted the whole of Series 1. He was up till 2:30 on a Friday night, tweeting the whole thing as it was broadcast on Channel 4. I was following that along and watching it all go out. And there have been some interesting stories. So the whole Nick Frost not acting before and in between series of Spaced, he worked in Chiquitos.
Wow.
He worked in Chiquitos and he went back after Series 1 finished because he thought it would be a one-and-done thing. He never thought it'd be commissioned for a second run, and then he's now a full-time actor.
Yeah. If you told me that Nick Frost had never done acting before, I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. He fits into this role so naturally. It's like somebody... He fits into this role like a warm pair of pajamas. Oh, yeah. It's great. Because he's obviously appeared in like training video clips and sales videos as well. So it's not like he's even had, but he had massive experience. No. It's incredible.
But to go from no experience to being one of the supporting roles in a major Channel 4 breakthrough comedy, that is quite a thing.
Yeah, I think he had bare minimum experience. He had 2 episodes on something called Big Train.
Yeah, iconic. A couple of supporting roles on that.
And that was it.
And then here he is working with his best mate on a show that he would have been so excited to work on. Just the filming Series 1. There wasn't much inside of any location stuff. The only real location we got to see were the iconic 23 Meteor Street, which is the house where it's all based, a couple of pubs around London, a couple of offices, a paintball course for later on in the series where some of the funniest jokes in the entire series are laid down, looking at Sarah Fenwick's character there. But it's also where that paintball course is where we get some of the best film references, because there's Jurassic Park references, there's references to a Schwarzenegger movie, Commando. And there's even a reference to Terminator. The end of that episode is like, there's a storm coming, Tim. It's just chock-a-block of references, and go that half hour every episode. You watch that half hour and it just flies by. It flies by every single episode.
Yeah. It's so perfect that time just becomes immaterial, and you're not watching just any ordinary TV show. You're watching something special, and you know it's something special. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of many other TV shows like that. I think Star Trek: The Next Generation, maybe.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially one of them. I'm trying to think. Blimey, I can't remember that far back in terms of TV. Yeah, so many. Like, I don't know how else I can put it, really.
It was a show that was ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
See, I would disagree. I don't think it was ahead of its time. Really? I think it was of its time, and I think it dared to be of its time, which is why it was so successful. I think that when you have a look at a lot of comedies or even a lot of dramas, they attempt to portray things that they think are actually happening when it's not the case. When you have a thing like when you have a thing like Spaced attempt essentially just looked at the world and like, right, what is this world? You know, let's look at the world. Let's create this world of pop culture, and base the characters in sort of realism of some characteristics of people that you would have no doubt met during those days. Obviously, it emphasizes the comedic aspects of them, and I think that because it was of the time, I think that's why it was quite popular, because it dared to say, look, there are these characters here who just want to live their dreams.
Yeah.
Boom.
And we even have like dream sequences that sort of show off what they really want to do, and especially Jessica Stevenson's character, we see Daisy fantasize about being quite a successful writer. Then we see her wake up and we realise that she's written absolutely nothing on her typewriter. One of the best running jokes in the entire show, that she just can't be motivated to write anything, and yet she wants to be a successful journalist.
Yeah. I remember the job interview she has with someone.
Yes.
She ends by going girl power.
It was with a magazine, Flaps magazine, if I remember rightly. Something like
that, yeah.
She finishes with girl power, and then she gets home dejected, and Tim goes to her, like, yeah, did you use girl power? He's like, yeah. Did you give this symbol? And then the V symbol gets given. So, and she immediately starts sobbing. It was Edgar and the team hit the nail on the head with that one, because of course Spice Girl. I think that was the year the Spice Girls film came out. So
yeah,
they were on the money there. They were on the money. But yeah, so some of these jokes, again, may not have dated well in terms of modern day society, but one of the things that I found particularly fascinating, given the fact that Edgar's been in the news this week with his new film, was some of the references to the horror genre. Because we know what's happening with Wright's new film, which is going to be released in April next year, Last Night in Soho, where he's going to be returning to the horror genre for the first time since Shaun of the Dead came out. What I'm particularly fascinated with this film is the fact that he's got a brand new screenwriter working with him on it, who isn't Nick Frost, who isn't Simon Pegg, who isn't even Jessica Stevenson. He's working with the girl who co-wrote 1917. What I'm excited about with this film is to see how the Edgar Wright style will work on someone else's script that he hasn't had much involvement in, and we've seen it kind of happen with Spaced. But could it be one of the reasons? Because of course, Edgar Wright, self-professed comic book fan, what would an Edgar Wright Ant-Man would have been like?
Yeah,
because
I think one of the things that was really obvious in Ant-Man, because if I remember rightly, he was originally going to
write and direct it, dropped out because of creative differences.
Yeah. But they still kept some things in the script that from Edgar Wright into the movie.
Yeah. There were a couple of sequences where you see the whip pans, and the scene where we see him using the powers for the first time, that is so obviously Edgar Wright's style. There is no shadow of a doubt about it.
Style in there. And I think Ant-Man suffered because of it, because it was like, well, hang on a minute. You're using Edgar Wright's style, which we can clearly see, but then you've got this other style of conventional Hollywood, which is clashing horribly with it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ant-Man wasn't... It was the most Marvel movie that they've released so far.
Yep, and it's no coincidence that after that they started giving the directors a little bit more creative freedom.
Yeah, and that's why Ant-Man and the Wasp was a little bit better.
But not as good as the other ones.
No, because it was
perfect post-Infinity War viewing.
Yeah, pretty much. Because and the reason it was good and better than the first Ant-Man was because the director's vision was all the way through and you could see it. So that pretty much tells all you need to know about Edgar Wright. It's like, no, you can't. I mean, again, going back to Tarantino, it's like people trying to copy Tarantino's style. You will notice it, but it's not as good as the original.
No.
You can't out Tarantino, and you can't out Edgar Wright. It doesn't work.
You definitely can't. I mean, although one thing to think about: if Edgar Wright had stayed on and done Ant-Man, we wouldn't have had Baby Driver. Which leads me into my next point here, because 1 year after he finished Spaced, Mint Royale came calling to do a couple of music videos. One of them was for Blue Song, and he's said many times again that the video for Blue Song was based on an idea that he had in 1995 for a feature film where about a driver who has earphones in, listening to music, and he's on his game when he has his music. So, again, Baby Driver is an idea he has had for over 20 years, and he was lucky to get it made.
Yeah. And one movie Baby Driver is, it has one of the best soundtracks imaginable.
Indeed. I mean, it is, yeah. That opening of Baby Driver, when Bell Bottoms kicks in. Oh.
Yeah. And again, you can see Edgar Wright's style within the first few moments of the introduction with, zoom ins, dolly shots, and whips. It's a thing to behold. I love Baby Driver.
Yeah. Music's always been one of Wright's strong points, especially in Spaced. Who could forget that one of the clubbing sequence, we see Mike appear from out of nowhere and you hear a remix of the A-Team music. Yeah,
Edgar Wright has been able to mix. He can mix sounds with visual up with the best of them.
Oh yeah.
I mean, again, this is very heavily done in Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Chris Evans walking out to the Universal Pictures theme music. Oh
yes. It's getting boring by the sea by Blood Red Shoes in the club. Mm-hmm. Brilliant stuff.
It's a visual juxtaposition of being able to take good music, good visuals, merge them together to get the best comedic impact. You don't get a director who can do that often. And Edgar's been doing this for nearly 20 years now.
Yeah.
And it explains why Channel 4 decided on a whim to air the whole first series of Space, and it won over a lot of new fans that evening. Which is what sort of thing that this show needs, because people don't really think about Space when they think about Edgar Wright. They always think, oh, Edgar Wright, yeah, he did Shaun of the Dead. That's on ITV2 every weekend, mate. Yeah.
So no, you have to watch Space to truly get how brilliant Shaun of the Dead is.
Yeah.
And yeah, so 2003 to 2013, Space pretty much opens the world to Wright and Pegg. Mm-hmm. And they decide, actually, do you know what? We're going to go to the big screen, and they decide to make Shaun of the Dead.
Which now, I literally have my copy of right here. They make, if you're watching on the Rip Ticket page, there it is. Literally have my copy to hand.
Very nice. So, where was I? Oh yeah, Shaun of the Dead. Now this is kind of a point where zombies were kind of in a resurgence, weren't they?
Yeah, it was a couple of years
George
after.
Romero.
28 days later had just come out as well.
Sorry?
28 days later had come out 2 years before Shaun as well.
So we're seeing evolution of the of zombies from the slow shuffling brains to, these running zombies in 28 days later.
Yeah.
And Shaun of the Dead, it's a zombie comedy.
The very first rom-zom-com, as it was described on the poster.
Which mixed the Brit flick romantic comedy style, and it was just an homage to George A. Romero and Sam Raimi. It essentially took characters from Space, rejiggled them a little bit.
Yeah.
and said, what if they were in a zombie apocalypse? And the result, it was a critical and financial success. It is being used to teach British comedy in film studies.
Oh yeah.
It's its rooting in the American genre as well only served to help it. Mm-hmm. Because now we've gone from having film references and references to cultures that British people can maybe understand, to an American genre, the zombie horror movie, the B movie, which you'd go to a drive-in theater to watch, now being lovingly, replicated and paid tribute to in its comedy style into the international world, and Americans loved it. Yeah. Like, Americans love Shaun of the Dead because to them that's British comedy,
and it's an easy Halloween costume. Because all you need, bit of shirt, is that blood on your shirt, red tie, and then boom, you're Shaun.
Pretty much. So after that, the pair looked into planning out a trilogy of genre comedies.
And they jokingly said, what are we going to call it? Yeah, the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy?
Yep.
It was a joke in an interview.
About the ice cream product Cornetto and its effectiveness as a hangover cure. I haven't actually tried it yet, but apparently Edgar Wright swears by it. And what made this trilogy unique was that they were not connected by narrative, but by their shared traits and motifs. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the two films that followed would essentially be tributes to different kinds of films that people would grow up with. So you'd have Hot Fuzz, the comedy action thriller, which paid tribute to those 90s action movies where everything was just completely blown up. But in proper British comedy style,
yes.
Two policemen in a sleepy village town.
One of the things that they've said on the DVD commentary, because they interviewed a lot of actual police in the making of the film, and one of the compliments they had from actual officers, like, yeah, you got the one thing that people assume about us, right? The paperwork. Because you have Nicholas Angel running by the law, and again, lots of star cameos in that film. Cate Blanchett popped up, Peter Jackson as Father Christmas in the opening.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you see Simon Pegg do a lot in that film is paperwork, especially when he takes in the underage drinkers. He's like, yeah, buy the book. And yet he's doing all this in the quietest, most quaintest countryside village in the UK. Which makes it just so funny. Yep.
And then they move on. There's a little bit of a gap in between. Because
they all went off to their solo projects.
There's a huge gap. In between that, you have Wright. He brings out Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
And Pegg and Frost do Porg, which
he helped. He helped with Tintin, The Adventures of Tintin. He directed a trailer called in Quentin Tarantino's Grindhouse called Don't.
And he wants to develop that into a full film. He actually wants to do a full film.
And then, of course, in 2013, The World's End, which I think is the weakest of the Cornetto trilogy.
Definitely the weakest.
Because it's not obvious as to what it's paying homage to. I think it pays an homage to a little too much. Because you've got like the British binge movie where people are trying to recapture their lost youth and live in a pointless world. Sort of similar to Trainspotting, but then you've got like the martial arts fighting scenes, and then you've got sci-fi. And I think it was at this point Edgar Wright tried to out Edgar Wright himself.
Well, it was all, created, at that point he had an eye on Ant-Man. At that point, he had his eyes on Ant-Man.
Yeah,
before it all went down.
What happened was essentially Wright suffered a critical malfunction, and created sort of like a paradox where he righted upon his rights, and it went completely crazy. Still a great movie.
Oh yeah, still
Don't
good.
get me wrong. Nick Frost, absolutely fantastic, and it was the most mature movie as well out of the Cornetto trilogy. It takes these characters tropes from Spaced, updates them a little bit to the 2013s. These are, and brings them into the forefront and shows how they sort of evolve and grow. And in the midst of an alien invasion, it's crazy. Still watch it. Don't get me wrong. It's a great movie. Still watch it, but you probably shouldn't. I would say The World's End is probably the best one to watch first.
Yeah, and then
go for Hot Fuzz, and then go for
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Watch them in reverse
That's
order.
exactly how I did it. I did World's End first, then Fuzz, and then Shaun.
It works though, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it does work because you can see, of course, the films get better. It's no coincidence that The World's End was the highest budget of the entire Cornetto trilogy. And again, we've talked in our previous live. We talked about how filmmakers generally have a nice little budget that they like to work with. The guy who did Alien Resurrection, big major Hollywood movie, it tanked. Comes back a few years later with a French film called Amélie, becomes the talk of Hollywood cinema. It's almost like these filmmakers need to start understanding their limits a little bit more. Just don't go too big on the ambition, which is why Edgar came back with a passion project.
Yeah. And then obviously he was in 2014. He was developing a live action film based on Ant-Man with Joe Cornish since 2016. However, in 2014 he left. This is what he said the reason was. The most diplomatic answer is, I wanted to make a Marvel movie, but I don't think they really wanted to make an Edgar Wright movie. Having written all my other movies, that's a tough thing to move forward. Suddenly, becoming a director for hire on it, you're sort of less emotionally invested, and you start to wonder why you're there, really. And
it may explain the whole the meme that's become the thing of, oh yeah, I got sacked from Star Wars. Because the same thing happened to Phil Lord and Chris Miller on Solo. They wrote it. The same thing happened to Colin Trevorrow on what would eventually become The Rise of Skywalker, and we know how that turned out. It is almost like these big Hollywood Goliaths are like not able to see the talent in these directors, which again explains why Sony were quite bold in late 2017 to release an Edgar Wright movie in the middle of summer with none of the Cornetto collaborators. And here we are, 3 years later, Baby Driver is still beloved by a lot of audiences.
I think that Edgar Wright wasn't just lucky because he had his gang with him. It proved that he had something there all along. And it proved that he was a true auteur, that you could take his style, his emotional investment in characters, which he began with Spaced and evolved over the course of a long and successful career, which is still going along. It proved that you could take all that with any actors and make it into an Edgar Wright movie, and it would still be damn good.
Oh yeah. This is what I'm looking forward to, his next film, because it looks to be a return to the genre that he redefined for British audiences back in 2004. Because, of course, Last Night in Soho is the next big project he's working on. Alongside a documentary about the band Sparks, he's been working on that for 2 years, because he tweets about it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But he's a director who's not afraid to do what he wants to do. And he's not afraid to speak his mind about it either. As proven with what happened on Ant-Man.
Yeah. Other potential projects as well include the expansion of his Don't Fake trailer, which was in Grindhouse, adaptations of the TV series The Night Stalker, as well as adaptations of the book The Grasshopper Jungle, and Fortunately the Milk, as well as a possible sequel to Baby Driver.
Oh, Sony have confirmed a sequel is definitely happening on Baby Driver. Sony want it badly.
And in a sense, kind of ending full circle to where we began, as we say that Edgar Wright is obviously the king of popular culture, and his knowledge of popular culture rivals that of Tarantino's film. In 2019, he made an appearance as a non-player character in Hideo Kojima's
Death Stranding, yes.
Stranding.
I was a little bit surprised when that cameo appeared. He's like, oh my god, so he went to Japan and did a scan, because Kojima scanned a lot of people, even scanned game critics in just for the sheer hell of it. But for Edgar Wright to appear, and it looks exactly like him as well. When I see the pictures, like, wow, they did a good job.
Yeah. But that's it. Cut, wrap, print, Edgar Wright.
Edgar Wright
done.
is God. Edgar Wright is a god.
He is definitely one of the best British talents in cinema going today.
Yeah.
And his work will be viewed through a lens by film and TV media tutors and scholars for a very long time. He's one of the greats.
I know with the film production students I worked with last year, they talk about Edgar Wright a lot in terms of their first year filmmaking course.
Yeah.
I will not be surprised if that continues. I might send a text to the lecturer I work with about that later on. I'll let Ed know. But that is almost it for this week's Rip Ticket Review. Mr. Carver, what are we talking about next Sunday?
I do believe that I have a hankering to talk about the Marvel Universe.
Yes,
most specifically, most specifically, talking about the superhero genre before the Marvel Universe, and why exactly did Marvel get it right?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I rewatched Justice League for the first time since the cinemas on Wednesday morning, and I can really see the mistakes that DC have made over the years, and we'll elaborate more on it next week. But it is clear that DC didn't know what they were doing. Marvel had a certain way of doing things, a certain way of making their films, a blueprint, if you will. And it paid off quite handsomely, because they now have the highest grossing movie of all time.
Well, let's talk about it next week.
Yeah, that is our topic next week. Marvel, what did they get right, and how did DC fail so much?
And what lessons can be learned for the future?
How lessons can be learned for the future, knowing that the Snyder Cut actually exists. So that'll be next week from 3 o'clock here on the Facebook page. For our podcast listeners, we're available on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your audio from. It's going to be a good one next week. I could just feel that one of us could implode ranting about how DC failed so badly. So I'll bring
enough time has passed now.
Yeah, the time has passed.
Over
yeah. So I'll bring my Earl Grey just in case I need to be mellowed out. But that will be next week here on the Rip Ticket Review. So until next Sunday at 3 o'clock and a couple of hours thereafter on the podcast feed, I've been Jack Smit.
I've been Dan Carver.
We will see you next Sunday from 3 p.m. Until then, we'll see you at the movies.